Welcome back, everyone. So, Industry 4.0 transformation is fraught with risk and loaded with opportunity. Really, we're here to find out from Pavan Muzumdar, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Automation Alley, to think about how we get it right in our organization. What if you implement a solution that doesn't work as well as you expected? Let's hear from Pavan Muzumdar, who's COO at IACC's conference partner, Automation Alley. Automation Alley is Michigan's Industry 4.0 Knowledge Center and have been on the path of Industry 4.0 since 2016. He'll be explaining Industry 4.0 in more detail and how to do it right, from the 4Ds of disruption to the duality mindset that you're going to need to succeed, as well as the critical priorities. Pavan, over to you.
Good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about our Industry 4.0 lessons learned on our journey at Automation Alley, as we've gone down the path of trying to sort of figure out what Industry 4.0 is all about. And when I was talking to Mr. Wazirkar, we thought it would be really good for us to just share some of our experiences. The way I kind of see this, no one's really an expert on Industry 4.0. We're all kind of, on different, junctures of the journey, but be happy to share, what we've learned. And so with that, let's get started. So as I said, the title of this presentation is, Industry 4.0 Transformation Lessons Learned. A little bit about us at Automation Alley. Automation Alley is the Industry 4.0 Knowledge Center for the state of Michigan. And we've been on this path since about 2016. And really our goal is to help our small and medium-sized manufacturer base really kind of deal with this Industry 4.0 challenge that everybody is facing. And if we kind of want to define what Industry 4.0 is, it's the convergence of digital and physical technologies that's disrupting, in our particular context, the manufacturing industry, even though it's actually touching all industries. And so one of the things we did as an organization is try to be the knowledge center. And by being the knowledge center, we have several initiatives. Integr8 is our big conference that we hold in November every year. Obviously, due to COVID, we had to do this virtual, but it also gave us this opportunity to partner with the IACC on taking some of our content and distributing it around the world to share some of the knowledge that we've gained. So really thrilled to be part of that. So starting off with, what is really Industry 4.0? And the way we kind of see it, Industry 4.0 is really the coming together of digital and physical technologies. And what we mean by that is that if the first industrial revolution was about the internal combustion engine and really just simulating human muscle power, animal muscle power, the second was mass production, the third one was automation initially, and computerization. The fourth industrial revolution is the integration of these cyber and digital systems. And that brings about a lot of complexity. Now, we've kind of dissected them into the 8 sectors that you see in front of you, but really that's just to simplify it. It's important not to get too hung up about, is it one or the other? Does one fit here? Does one, do you combine the two? That's really not the goal. The goal is to kind of maybe just to simplify it a little bit, but then really look at some core principles that we'll share with you on, on what we've learned over the path that we've taken. So first question, right? Why should you care? Why does a company have to care when they are faced with Industry 4.0, or what we like to say, digital disruption? And the simple answer is that the Industry 4.0 wave is going to be the biggest organizational disruptive force of our lifetimes. And so you might have heard the saying that the change you see today is the slowest that you will see from now on. In other words, change is only accelerating. What's really interesting is that in a lot of cases, change sort of slows down when you have disruptive events. 2020 saw this massive disruption due to COVID, and actually paradoxically, the change of digitization accelerated during COVID. And so it's kind of this thing that we're all trying to put our arms around. There's another concept, it's called the second half of the chessboard, where you basically have, as you compound and double, by the time you reach sort of 32 doubles, you see that the numbers become so staggeringly high, even our human comprehension makes it very difficult to understand this. And so when we kind of contextualize that with Moore's law, which was postulated in about the late 50s, early 60s, which says that computing power doubles every 18 months to 2 years, we're already seeing more than 32 doubles during the time frame. Now, some people are saying Moore's law is kind of, it's petering out. But what it's also led to is this network effect. So that exponential change is what we're seeing. And so what that exponential change causes is massive disruption in companies. And the first thing we need to understand is, why do companies get disrupted? And what we've basically observed is that when companies become really good at something, they become super focused on what they do. So they have a strong operational focus. The problem is, if that operational focus isn't clearly arced with or attached to or connected to the mission of the organization, what that does is it causes mission confusion. And when you have mission confusion, you have the risk of business viability. Now, that may never happen, but in the case of a disruptive force, that business viability becomes real. So taking a real example, you're all familiar with what happened with Kodak. Now, Kodak was the leader in film manufacturing for almost 100 years, probably more, right? They started to define themselves as, we make film. And even though as an organization, as a company, they invented the digital camera, they completely missed the digital wave. So they defined themselves as a film manufacturer, and then anything that was outside that scope, that realm, became something that was foreign to them. And that is the risk that we have to be very careful not to fall into, that trap that not to fall into. So what exactly happened? It was an organizational issue and a cultural issue, which we'll see later on. But Kodak was organized for film production, and it needed to transform into an electronics hardware company. And that transformation is very, very complex. And you will see this over and over again. When companies need to transform organizationally, that's one of the hardest transformations to make. So with that context, let's kind of look at some of the lessons that we've learned in terms of the impact of Industry 4.0 on business. So the first thing I'd like to share with you is this concept of the 4Ds of digital disruption. And these 4Ds are actually very insidious in some ways, and sometimes aren't very apparent, but they're extremely powerful. So the first one is what we call disintermediation. When you have digital technologies coming into a business environment, it tends to, because of the access of information, disintermediate middlemen. And so if your business model is where you're just being a middleman without actually adding any value to the transaction, it's very likely that the two people that you're providing that mediation service to will connect and find a way to connect. That's disintermediation. The second thing is, as more and more digital technology starts kind of coming forward, we see this concept of dematerialization. And that means that things, products, systems become smaller. So an excellent example would be the first audio recordings in the early 1900s were on wax cylinders, and they only had maybe the ability to do a couple of minutes of recording. That led to vinyl, which is our beloved records. That had about, 20 minutes per side or something like that. That then led to tape, which was even smaller, a little bit more capacity, that led to optical discs, and those had more capacity. But today, we have hard drives that are tiny and carry massive, massive amounts of information. That also is something we need to be concerned about. We need to know, are our products going to be dematerialized, and are our products going to become smaller? Because if there's something that are in the information exchange space, we're going to basically see that. It's something that, an example of that is what happened in the printing industry. If information starts flowing electronically, the demand for commercial printing goes down. The third one is demonetization. And what we mean by that is the business transaction starts converging to sharing and to valuing attention over just money. An example of demonetization is all your social media platforms where they're trying to get you to pay attention because you're not paying them any money, but you're giving them your attention, and that attention is monetized on the back end. So for example, if you've heard the saying, if you're not paying for a product, you are the product, that's an example of demonetization. But the most interesting force, the most interesting D that we like to talk about is democratization. And that means the access of digital technology is becoming more and more inexpensive, enabling the smallest of players to participate on that global scale. An example would be what used to be on-prem software maybe 20 years ago, now is available on the cloud at much higher capabilities, but at significantly lower cost. And so that is leveling the playing field where really it's your human intellect and your ability to collaborate as a team and your culture to deliver great products starts becoming more and more important. The other lesson we've learned is that technology evolves very rapidly while business models tend to respond slowly. And the reason for that is technology doesn't really have a cultural barrier. Business models, on the other hand, require human acceptance of those business models. So you'll often see that what this leads to is something called Amaras Law. Amara was a futurist in Silicon Valley, and what he basically said was that in the short term, you will overestimate the pace of change of technology, but in the long run, you'll underestimate it. So your expectation of technology change goes this way, but what technology actually does is this way. So if you don't make the right investments in the learning, not necessarily the implementation, but the learning of the technology, you can be left behind. The other challenge that leaders face is that financial analysts tend to undervalue physical assets in this day and age and overvalue digital assets. So you'll see this, for example, at least in the industry, that's dominant in Michigan, the state where I come from. The automotive industry has been struggling with this. We have our big three automotive companies, and they have market valuations significantly lower than someone like a Tesla who's out on the west coast of the US in Silicon Valley. And they've kind of looked at it completely differently. And the executives are always very frustrated that these valuations are out of whack. Well, that's exactly why that happens. So the question becomes, what do we do about it? And we have to really respond to this challenge that we call the challenge of our times. That is to overlay a digital mindset on a physical business. And when you do that successfully, that's when you're on your path to transformation. And if you don't do that successfully, then you will be facing the risks that you see. So what does that actually mean? What does a physical versus digital mindset mean? Let's take a look at how we look at physical products versus digital products, right? So physical products, you design them and then you figure out a way to scale them. You figure out a way to, you design a component and then you figure out how do I make 1 million of these? You have to be all consistent about this. So the first product, which is your design, has to be identical to the millionth product. The millionth product has to be a perfect copy in an ideal world. The change to these products tends to be very incremental. You don't make quantum changes to these products. Processing these products requires serial access. You can't work on these products in parallel. You have to, you go through sort of this assembly line type system. And then finally, in terms of throughput, that's really what you value. You value throughput. On the digital side, it's different. You design to scale. In other words, your design is the product. It's the scaling that is already embedded into the design. Similarly, you don't value consistency as much as you value variability. No one's going to go to a website over and over again if it doesn't change. Change tends to be exponential, not incremental, because it's very easy to make changes in code. And often in your physical product, you can access that product in parallel. If I have a file containing some data, I can run multiple algorithms on it in parallel. I don't need to serialize it. And then finally, we're really interested in iterations. Google used to have a saying that all software is in beta, that it never really changes. And that's one of the things that brings huge complexity to the digital mindset, to the digital world. In terms of business models, physical business models tend to be about ownership. It's about a product that tends to be static. The medium of exchange is often money. Ownership tends to be exclusive. If I own something, it's unlikely someone else is going to be able to own it. And then they tend to be very competitive. It's difficult to gain a foothold that's monopolistic. On the digital side, however, it's not about ownership, it's about experience. What experience are you delivering to your customer? What service are you delivering to the customer, not necessarily a product? And you're really interested in attention that can then be monetized. So the primary goal is to get the customer's attention. And the experience is shared. You don't need to necessarily have exclusive ownership. Now, of course, there might be certain products that are created specifically for a customer. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about mass products, right? So shared experiences can happen. If Netflix has one movie, you can have 100, a million viewers streaming it in parallel. The business models tend to be monopolistic. Companies that tend to take that early lead, if they can maintain that lead with iterations, it's very difficult to unseat them, and you'll see this over and over again. Finally, what does digital and physical capital management look like? On the physical side, we value equipment. We're valuing this concept of allocation of capital, and we do something called NPV, net present value analysis, when we allocate that capital. And it's interesting because that's what our CFOs are trained on. As a financial analyst, that's what I learned on the physical side. But on the digital side, it's completely different. We don't value equipment as much as we value the personnel, that intellectual capital that we bring at the table, bring on board, that can use that equipment. We have to pay attention to liquidity, because if we have liquidity, we have a lot of options. That leads into that final bullet, which is we have to look at it more from the standpoint of options analysis, make many bets, and one of them might hit. And that's why you'll see, venture capitalists in the digital world have a completely different way of kind of allocating capital. They're not necessarily doing that traditional valuation. They're looking at, how quickly can this scale rapidly, massively, so that we can get some massive exponential growth. But here's what's interesting. In a pure digital world, that makes sense. In an Industry 4.0 digital world, all those slides that we saw, the physical and digital, come together. It's no longer an or, it's an and. That means we have to look at equipment, but we also have to look at personnel. We have to look at allocation. We also have to look at liquidity. We have to look at a static product that might have some dynamic elements to it. For example, if you have a vehicle that has some connected capabilities, the vehicle is the physical object, but the connected capabilities are that add-on service that you add to it. So the next lesson is that physical will always be relevant if driven by a digital strategy. In other words, physical is not going to go away, and it's very hard for digital companies to become physical as opposed to physical companies becoming digital. Now, that's a reality maybe today, but that's also changing. So it's important that we don't just sit there and say, oh, it's hard for them to do this, because everything changes. Everything is in a state of flux. So with that, one of the things I'd like to share with you is what we've kind of learned, and we'll call these the 5 principles of digital transformation. So once we've kind of created that context on what we do, what a company should be looking for, these are the 5 principles of digital transformation that we've uncovered. So the first one is, and probably the most critical, is instead of being a company that happens to be in the business of X or making X, you need to transform into a software company that happens to be in the business of X. We'll see an example of that later on. But if you look at, for example, Tesla, which I mentioned before, whether you hate them or love them, it's a very, don't want to get down this path of, some of the controversy, but fundamentally, they started off as a digital company, as a software company, because they were started by digital natives that have then become physical companies that have created physical products. Amazon was primarily a software company that happened to go into first book distribution, then cloud services, and today sort of the everything store, a platform as a marketplace. The second thing that we need to do is we need to understand and accept the digital and physical duality. That is, it's not an either or, it is an and. And so you can't just be the software company. You need to have some domain expertise that you overlay on that software business. And that's probably the promise and the opportunity that a lot of our physical businesses have, is there's deep physical knowledge. We just need to overlay that on a digital mindset. And so really understand that. The third thing is we need to integrate that those two processes of physical and digital engineering. There's this concept that you might hear, it's called the clock cycle. Digital products tend to iterate very quickly. Physical products iterate over a slower arc, but you need to integrate those two plans so that you have this roadmap that is consistent with each other. The fourth one is this concept of, on the customer facing side, explore the product service duality. And so in the US, for example, we have companies that are now offering connectivity services over and above the base product that they're offering, right? So this is an example of there's the product, and then what service can we offer over that product to keep that revenue sticky. And then the last one is this concept of make small bets using an agile framework. And this means trying not to predict whether something would be successful, but making these controlled experiments and learning constantly from those controlled experiments. That's sort of the concept that we really need to embrace. So with that, how do you do that? What is the path that an organization needs to follow to get to that point? So the first thing is you've got to start with a great culture. If you don't have a great culture, you will not get to the next step, which is being the learning organization. And then if you're not a learning organization, it becomes extremely difficult to manage disruption. And so what we basically say is if you work on the culture and you open up the culture to become more learning focused, not a focus on things like failure and why did something go wrong, but what can we learn from this, that learning becomes permeated into the entire organization. And that then helps us manage disruption. So actually, there's an excellent example of that. I was listening to an interview of Jeff Immelt, who was the CEO of General Electric. And if you've been following some of the history of GE was a high-flying company in the 80s and the 90s. And then Jeff Immelt took over, I think it was like 2 days after, or maybe a few days before 9/11, 2001, and has struggled with the digital transformation. Not that he didn't recognize it. And this, by the way, is everything that he said. But what he said was that GE was foundationally a company that was based on management principles. And it needed to transform into a company that had a foundation of technological principles that would then be in that business of X that we talked about. And GE is in many, many X's, right? They make everything from appliances, at least back then, to heavy power, into engines, etc. So a lot of different industry, a lot of different capabilities. But he said that was the challenging change that they had to make. Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan has said that JP Morgan is a tech company that happens to be in financial services. And so that transition, that path that they need to take is going down through this approach. So what are the critical priorities that a leader needs to kind of look at? And we've kind of identified 3 big pillars that every leader needs to pay attention to. So the first one we've already talked about, right? You need to focus on the culture. It has to become a learning organization built on trust. Our team members need to feel that they can, make small moves, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes, share that knowledge within the organization. They won't get punished for taking initiative. It's very difficult to do that, but if we can do that, that's actually the start that you need. In fact, as a recommendation, there's a book called No Rules Rules by Reed Hastings of Netflix, and we'll look at Netflix in a little bit, where he talks about having that culture of trust and understanding. And the learning that I think we should take from it is Netflix is a pure digital company, but if there are elements of that we can include in our digital/physical companies, we'll be much easier, much more capable of moving forward. The second thing is finance. And what we mean by that is introducing the notion of optionality in decision making. And that is not forcing or requiring a known ROI, but understanding what the impact of the business is going to be on the existing state of the company and being able to allocate small amounts of capital for learning and then understanding if that learning is going to be then converted into ROI capabilities. Back in the 90s in Good to Great, Jim Collins called this, shoot bullets first and then cannonballs. Make small moves to hit your target, and that's when you allocate a large amount of capital to really exploit the market to get the return that you're looking at. And then finally, technology. When we talk about technology, we're really looking for what is that technological arc that gets us close to the mission. If Kodak had defined themselves not as a film manufacturer, but as a company that captured human memories, maybe the outcome would have been a little bit different. We don't know, but that's what we're trying to say is what business are we really in and what technological move can we make to get to that arc. So with that, and in closing, I'd like to share with you this example that we kind of uncovered, which was Netflix. It's a great example in understanding transformation. So Netflix actually started off as a DVD rental company online, and back in the day, their biggest competitor or the big gorilla at the time, at least in the U.S., was Blockbuster. Blockbuster had dominated the market for videotape rentals. And they were also getting into DVD rentals, and they had stores all over the place. And Netflix came on, and they basically said, we're going to send DVDs by mail and, figured out how to make that model work. After they did that, knowing fully well that that was never going to be the destination, they went into cloud services. And in cloud services, they had to do third-party streaming because Netflix didn't have any of their original content. They were basically taking third-party content and then they were streaming it and essentially became a cloud services company. Today, Netflix is probably, if I'm not mistaken, the biggest producer of original content and across and globally. And what's interesting is that the focus is no longer cloud services, but it's in production. It's in essentially finding the right content for that right market and having a core competency about that, but also keeping these other business models alive. In fact, in the US, there still are a few million DVD rental customers. We still see third-party content being streamed, and the cloud services infrastructure is still very much alive, very much capable, because that's what the original content is streamed on. And then today, they're all into production and are now sort of becoming, a dominant player, if not the most dominant player in some of our awards in original content. So this arc that you see, it's three distinct business models. But what's interesting is that the underlying foundation of that is that it was always a digital-first company, that Netflix always looked at itself as we're a software company that happens to be doing DVD rentals, cloud services or third-party streaming, and original content. So that's a great lesson for us to learn. The other example I shared with you was Amazon Foundation is a digital company, book sales, third-party cloud services, and then the everything store. And you'll see this in some of our other companies as we've kind of learned. So with that, thank you so much for this opportunity. Really enjoyed sharing this content with you. And if we have a few minutes, I'd love to take some questions and have some discussion about the content. Thank you.
So thanks, Pavan, very much for that. And really interesting to hear you talk about the fact that it's all about the culture, actually, more than anything else. And in a way, I think that sentiment has been echoed throughout the sessions that we've had previously. We're running out of time. I'd just like to very quickly give you a virtual certificate, which is going to be emailed over to you. And to let you know that as a token of our appreciation, we will be planting a tree in your honor of being part of this.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So great. Thank you, and regards to Detroit from this side of the world. Thanks, Pavan, and stay tuned, everyone. We're going to move to our next session, which is going to be an insightful panel discussion looking at what organizations need to do to succeed with Industry 4.0. So thank you, and see you after the break.